The burden of the crimes and atrocities committed by the Nazis was heavy for their surviving family members to bear. Undoubtedly, the person who carried the heaviest burden of them all was a tiny, shy woman from Austria, the closest surviving relative to the mastermind of the Nazi evil machine, Adolf Hitler, his sister Paula. Paula Hitler was Adolf Hitler's only full sister. Another sister of his and 3 other brothers didn't survive their childhood. In such conditions, Paula and Adolf created a special bond. That was until Adolf left home and began his journey of destiny. Paula continued a life of her own. She received commercial training and worked as a clerk for the Austrian state insurance company in Vienna during the 1920s. However, in 1930, she got fired from her job, allegedly because of her brother's reputation. Adolf Hitler then supported her financially with a monthly payment of 250 shillings, which later rose to 500 Reichmarks. During the war years, Adolf insisted on Paula living far from the eyes of the public. He even suggested she take a new surname, Wolf, a nickname Adolf used in the 1920s. And so, Paula Wolf spent much of the war living in Vienna incognito. No one in her vicinity knew she was Führer's sister. Then, on April 14, 1945, 2 SS officers came to Paula's house and brought her to Berchtesgaden. At Berchtesgaden, she received 100,000 Reichsmarks on Hitler's orders. The same amount he allocated to her half-sister Angela. After the war ended, Paula was soon arrested by the American forces. It was on May 26, 1945. Paula was interrogated by the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, but was soon released. She returned to Vienna, where for the next 7 years she worked in an arts and crafts shop. On December 1, 1952, Paula moved to Berchtesgaden to pursue claims arising from Adolf Hitler's personal will. The proceedings to settle Hitler's estate were hindered primarily by the lack of an official death certificate for Adolf Hitler. On October 2, 1948, a denazification tribunal in Munich classified Hitler as a chief offender, despite not having a death certificate. The tribunal confiscated all of Hitler's property, including a house in Munich, several houses near Berchtesgaden, and a claim of roughly 5 million marks against the publishing firm of Ehe in Munich. The court denied Paula Hitler's claim to the legacy left to her in Hitler's personal will. During the legal proceedings, Paula's efforts were also hindered by ongoing confusion and disputes over jurisdiction between the courts in Berchtesgaden and Berlin-Schöneberg, Hitler's principal places of residence. The federal court in Berchtesgaden ultimately held jurisdiction. The local federal judge, Dr. Heinrich Stephanus, began proceedings in late 1952, which lasted until early 1956. Stephanus conducted a thorough investigation, hearing 42 witnesses, 13 of whom had only returned from Russian prisoner of war camps in 1955 and 1956. Despite these challenges, Paula persisted in her efforts to secure her claims. She continued to live quietly in Berchtesgaden, avoiding public attention. Paula Hitler died on June 1, 1960, in Schönau near Berchtesgaden at the age of 64. 5 months later, the federal court in Berchtesgaden issued a certificate of inheritance, awarding 2/3 of Hitler's estate to Paula. The family of the Reichsführer SS, tales of betrayal and tragedy. Although directly related to Adolf Hitler, Paul couldn't be held responsible for his actions. It was not her fault she was his sister. Yet this was not the case with our next Nazi survivor. This lady chose to partner with the embodiment of Nazi evil, the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. Her name is Margaret Himmler, and she was his wife. Margaret Himmler, born Margaret Boden, came from a wealthy land-owning family. During World War I, she joined the German Red Cross as a nurse. The war had a deep impact on her, leaving her with a sense of loss and a view of the world that was pessimistic. After the war, she got married, but the marriage ended in divorce after only 2 years. In 1923, with financial help from her father, Margaret bought into a private clinic in Berlin run by a Jewish gynecologist. In 1927, Margaret met Heinrich on a train from Munich to Berlin. Himmler was 8 years younger than Margaret. They began exchanging letters almost daily. Himmler shared Margaret's interest in alternative medicine, partly because he suffered from chronic stomach problems. They became physically intimate during a 3-day stay in a Bavarian town just before Christmas. Margaret and Himmler decided to marry as soon as possible. They got married on July 3, 1928, in a Berlin registry office. Margaret's father and brother were witnesses. Himmler's parents, being committed Catholics, struggled to accept his marriage to an elder Protestant woman and did not attend the wedding. Margaret and Heinrich had a daughter named Gudrun in 1929. The family lived a structured life, reflecting Himmler's strict ideals. However, their marriage faced many strains due to Himmler's absences and infidelity. Heinrich had an affair with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, something that deeply affected Margaret. Although not so significant, Margaret did have a role of her own in Nazi Germany. She was involved with the German Red Cross and supervised various facilities during the war. She accompanied Himmler at official events, but was not part of the inner social circles of the Nazi elite. She did, however, support her husband's political activities and was known for her anti-Semitic views. After World War II ended, Margaret and her daughter Gudrun were detained by Allied forces. Being the wife of the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, Margaret had to go through several denazification trials. These trials aimed to purge German society of Nazi ideology and hold individuals accountable for their involvement with the Nazi regime. The process included classifying individuals into categories such as major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons, with corresponding penalties ranging from execution and imprisonment to fines and restrictions on employment. Initially classified as a major offender, Margaret's status changed several times throughout these trials. She argued for her release by claiming she had only been a nurse and was never involved in her husband's crimes. Despite these claims, Margaret struggled to defend her past actions and associations. The trials were a source of immense stress and uncertainty for Margaret. In the end, the court finally classified her as Category 4, Mitläuferin, the follower. As such, she was not held responsible for her husband's actions, but was still sentenced to 30 days punitive work. She also lost her pension rights and the right to vote. Following her release, Margaret lived with her sister in Hepen, but then moved to live with her daughter Gudrun in Munich. The two lived in a small apartment, a stark contrast to the comfort Margaret enjoyed in Nazi Germany. She also faced significant financial difficulties as she battled for pensions she believed were owed to her. The post-war period was indeed challenging for Margaret, as she had to adjust to a new reality where she was no longer part of the ruling elite. The loss of status and wealth weighed heavily on her. Margaret's personal life was also on a downfall. Her relationship with her daughter Gudrun became increasingly strained. Gudrun, who had idolized her father, found it hard to accept the new circumstances. She became involved with neo-Nazi groups, trying to uphold her father's legacy. Margaret disapproved of Gudrun's associations with neo-Nazi elements, and this involvement caused tension between them. Unlike her daughter, Margaret was trying to live a low-profile life. Throughout her post-war life, Margaret remained largely out of the public eye. She continued to face financial hardships and health issues. Bearing the stigma of her husband's actions and her own involvement in the Nazi regime, Margaret's attempts to secure financial support were most often met with bureaucratic obstacles. The difficult years of navigating a new, challenging reality left a profound impact on Margaret, shaping her final years in ways she had never anticipated during her time as the wife of Heinrich Himmler. She died on August 25, 1967, at the age of 73, as a bitter, exhausted, and utterly frustrated woman. Margaret's post-war life was a total contrast to the life of her daughter Gudrun. Gudrun Himmler, born in 1929, grew up in a structured environment, reflecting her father's strict ideals. Her father, being a key figure in Hitler's regime, deeply influenced her upbringing. Himmler, rarely at home, tried to make his Gudrun a model daughter. He preached decency, good manners, obedience, and diligence in school. He sent her postcards with SS symbols and SS newsletters to read. Gudrun, the good Nazi girl, wrote letters to the front, made gifts for SS soldiers, and joined the Bund Deutscher Madel at 10. She also wrote to her father almost daily with longing letters. The daughter missed her traveling puppy. She had no idea what kind of person her father truly was. However, as the war was nearing its end, this was about to change. When the fall of Nazi Germany became a matter of days, Himmler ordered his staff to organize an escape for his family. On April 19, 1945, one of his closest associates took Margaret and Gudrun to South Tyrol. "Where we are going must remain a secret, under a false name," she wrote in her diary. However, on May 13th, American soldiers arrested Gudrun and her mother and took them to an internment camp in Italy. 10 days later, Gudrun learned that her beloved father had poisoned himself in British captivity. After a year and a half of living in harsh conditions of internment camps, Gudrun and her mother were released in late 1946. The two of them found refuge in the Bodelschwing institutions, founded by an evangelical pastor in Bethel. Gudrun learned tailoring there. This period was extremely challenging for Gudrun, who had idolized her father and struggled to come to terms with the new reality. In 1952, she moved to Munich trying to find a job, but her father's name often stood in her way. Nevertheless, proud of being her father's daughter, she continued to call herself Gudrun Himmler until she married Dieter Böwitz, a functionary in the Bavarian branch of the National Democratic Party of Germany, a political organization scrutinized for its extremist positions and historical connections to neo-Nazi ideology. Unlike her mother, Gudrun was determined to uphold her father's legacy and refused to renounce his actions or beliefs. Gudrun's involvement with neo-Nazi groups became a significant part of her post-war life. She worked to maintain the memory of prominent Nazis and supported former SS members and their families. By being active in organizations that provided aid to these individuals, she showed her continued loyalty to her father's ideals. One of the organizations in which Gudrun was most active was the notorious Stille Hilfe, or the Silent Help. Silent Help was founded in 1951 to assist war convicts, a euphemism for war criminals. For old comrades, Silent Help collected money, smuggled messages into prisons, and lobbied politicians for clemency releases. The association used dubious channels as well as the services of prominent Christian Democratic Union and Christian Social Union representatives like Franz Josef Strauss and Alfred Dreger. The Catholic Church also apparently got involved. When asked who had helped him escape after the war criminal Josef Schwamberger laconically replied, "The Pope." This, boviously Nazi organization, was recognized as a charitable organization until 1998. However, a far more controversial fact was that Gudrun worked as a secretary at BND, the Federal Intelligence Service of Germany headquarters in Pullach near Munich, from 1961 to 1963. At that time, the organization was under the control of Reinhard Gehlen, a former Nazi military intelligence commander. Gudrun continued to be involved in neo-Nazi activities, and over time became a prominent figure in far-right circles. Gudrun's activities went well beyond helping the old comrades and included organizing reunions of SS veterans and participating in events that commemorated the Nazi era. She used her position and connections to advocate for the rights of former SS members, often speaking out against the treatment they received after the war. Gudrun's unwavering support for her father and his ideals made her a controversial figure. She faced criticism and scrutiny from those who viewed her actions as an attempt to glorify a dark chapter in history. Despite this, Gudrun remained steadfast in her beliefs and continued her activism until her later years. The relationship between Gudrun and Margaret remained strained throughout their lives. While Gudrun was vocal and active in her support for the Nazi legacy, Margaret sought to move away from that part of her life. This fundamental difference in their approaches to their past created a rift that was never fully healed. Gudrun Himmler died on May 24, 2018, at her home near Munich at the age of 88 as a free citizen of Germany, something her father denied to millions. She was a fervent Nazi till her last breath. Another of Himmler's close relatives who was forced to cope with his troublesome past after the war was his older brother Gebhard. Although he did not have as prominent a role as Heinrich, Gebhard was involved in the Nazi regime's activities and shared most of the nationalist and racist views of his famous brother. During the Nazi era, Gebhard worked in various roles, including various administrative positions, of which the most important was the position of the Department E Director within the Reich Ministry of Science, Education and Culture. As World War II came to an end, Gebhard, like many others associated with the Nazi leadership, including his brother, tried to avoid capture by the Allied forces. When the war was drawing to a close, he took refuge at his brother-in-law's clinic in Hohenleichen. It was the place set up by Heinrich Himmler as a temporary haven for Gebhard and his family. As the Allied forces closed in, Heinrich provided a car to help Gebhard's family flee to Schleswig-Holstein. Gebhard hoped that being in this area, under British control, would offer better chances for leniency than falling into the hands of the Soviets. Despite trying to slip through the hands of the Allied soldiers, Gebhard was ultimately captured. According to denazification categories, Gebhard was placed in the second highest category and labelled an offender. The following 3 years, Gebhard spent in several internment camps. Surprisingly, despite being interned, he maintained a degree of optimism. He organized activities within the camps, including a Christmas party for Bavarian prisoners, and documented his experiences through poetry and sketches. His internment ended when he was transferred to the Ungerstrasse camp in Munich, where he was finally released in July 1948. Post-war life for Gebhard seemed to have been more difficult than the one in internment camp. Due to his family background and his association with the Nazi regime, he struggled to reintegrate into society. He took a low-paying job in a factory making condensers, a far more humble engagement than his previous roles. Despite a troublesome background, Gebhard continued to seek ways to restore his professional status. In the early 1950s, he found a position at the European Afghan Cultural Institute, where he was engaged in organizing training places for Afghan students. This job allowed him to reconnect with his past professional contacts, though it did not provide the financial stability he desired. During that same period, Gebhard fought to restore his pension rights and professional reputation. It took him years of persistent effort to regain his pension. Finally, in 1959, his pension rights were restored, allowing him to enjoy a modest improvement in his quality of life. He and his wife began to have annual travels to Italy, a small luxury that marked a return to some semblance of normalcy. Throughout his post-war life, Gebhard attempted to defend his and his brother's actions during the Nazi era. He gave interviews and wrote notes portraying Heinrich Himmler as a man burdened by his duties rather than a willing perpetrator of horrible atrocities. In his writings and statements, Gebhard often sought to downplay the extent of their involvement in the regime's crimes. He described Heinrich as a dangerous romantic who was misled by his loyalty to Hitler. Gebhard also meticulously documented his family's history, creating chronological albums and arranging family documents. He avoided direct discussion of Hitler in his memoirs, attempting to present his life as one of a patriotic civil servant who had been unfairly punished after the war. This portrayal was part of his broader effort to distance himself from the full implications of the Nazi regime's actions. Gebhard remained in contact with other family members, including Heinrich's daughter Gudrun, whom he supported as much as possible in the post-war years. He died in Munich on June 22, 1982. The family of the Reichsmarschall, the fate of the princesses. For many of the Nazi leaders' closest persons, it was hard to distance from these persons, no matter how horrifying were things they did. Such was the case with Emmy Goring, the wife of Hermann Goring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest associates. Emmy was famous in Germany for her career as an actress even before her marriage. However, after she married Hermann, her publicity skyrocketed. She was under constant public attention and was always photographed. Due to his charm and sociability, she served as a hostess at many state ceremonies before the outbreak of the Second World War. This role earned her the unofficial title of the First Lady of the Third Reich. After World War II, Emmy Goring's popularity went on a downfall. She was put through the denazification process, accused of benefiting from her husband's position and of being complicit in the Nazi regime's crimes. During her trial, Emmy defended herself by stating that she had always acted out of love for her husband and had not engaged in any criminal activities. She also highlighted her efforts to help Jews and other persecuted individuals during the war. Several witnesses, including Jewish survivors, testified in her favor, acknowledging her help during those difficult times. Despite the testimonies in her favor, Emmy was not spared from taking the consequences of her association with the Nazi regime. Emmy's trial before the Denazification Tribunal took place on July 20, 1948. She faced the proceedings calmly, confident that her actions during the war would speak for themselves. Indeed, testimonies of her colleagues from the theatre and the Jews she helped underscored the complexity of Emmy's character and her attempts to navigate the moral challenges of her time. Nevertheless, the court sentenced her to 1 year in prison and banned her from the stage for 5 years. After the release from prison, Emmy and her daughter Edda moved to Munich. They tried to rebuild their lives, carrying the heavy burden of their past. In her biography, My Life with Goring, Emmy reflected on her experiences with a sense of resilience, acknowledging both moments of happiness and profound sorrows that had marked her life. She described her marriage to Hermann Goring as a gift from God and emphasized the importance of her daughter Edda in giving her life meaning and purpose. Despite the challenges she went through in her post-war life, Emmy remained grateful for all the experiences that had shaped her. As she claimed, she found solace in the belief that all human trials, suffering, and sorrow could enrich one's life, if not allowed to overwhelm it. The remaining years of her life were marked by repercussions she had to face for her association with the Nazi regime, while striving to provide a stable and loving environment for her daughter. Emmy's daughter Edda Goring was also a public figure in Nazi Germany. She was not only her father's pet, but also of her godfather, none other than Adolf Hitler himself. Edda's birthday was celebrated almost as a national holiday, with her father arranging flight parades on the occasion. However, Edda's life drastically changed as World War II came to an end. In June 1945, the Americans transported Edda, her mother Emmy, and other family members to Weldenstein Castle. Despite the luxurious surroundings, life became precarious for the Goring family as they had to surrender all their valuables. While Emmy was imprisoned, 7-year-old Edda was moved to a convalescent home at Neuhaus, where Catholic sisters took care of her. They taught her basic skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic. In 1948, Emmy managed to get Edda into secondary school by convincing the headmistress, despite the lack of previous school reports. Throughout her school years, Edda was a model student, often favored by teachers and classmates. She excelled in her studies, receiving good grades and participating actively in extracurricular activities. Her father's name rarely came up in conversations, and politics was a taboo subject at school. After her mother's release from prison, Edda moved with her to live in a modest apartment in Munich. Edda initially pursued law but found it too dry and switched to working as a medical technical assistant in a Munich hospital laboratory. Despite her infamous surname, Edda claimed never to have faced significant difficulties because of it. In fact, she found her name advantageous at times, like during her trip to Spain, where she was treated with high regard and given special privileges. Edda never married and continued to live in Munich, surrounded by photos and paintings of her parents. Her apartment resembled a museum dedicated to her family. She maintained a strong bond with her father, expressing deep love and admiration for him. In interviews, she spoke fondly of her childhood and the care her father provided, but she also acknowledged the horrors of the Nazi regime without feeling personally responsible for the actions of her father and his associates. Nevertheless, her extreme loyalty to her father didn't allow Edda to denounce him or his actions. Unlike some other children of Nazi leaders who distanced themselves from their parents' legacies, Edda remained steadfast in her admiration for her father. This perspective offered her a sense of identity and continuity, but also isolated her from broader societal reconciliation processes. Edda Goring, the only child of Hermann and Emmy Goring, died in Munich on December 21, 2018, at the age of 80. Lina Heydrich, the Iron Widow of the Third Reich. Lina Heydrich, too, never denounced the action of her husband Reinhard, even though he was a vicious Nazi criminal and one of the key architects of the Holocaust. As familiar, Reinhard Heydrich was chief of the Reich Security Main Office and Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was the mastermind of the 1942 Wannsee Conference, at which the Nazis formalized plans for the final solution to the Jewish question, the deportation and genocide of all Jews in German-occupied Europe. He was assassinated by the Czechoslovak resistance fighters in the spring of 1942. As a widow of a Nazi hero, Lina enjoyed all the privileges until the end of the war. She spent the rest of the war living at an estate in Bohemia, at which she kept several dozen prisoners for forced labor. There were testimonies that very often she physically abused the prisoners. Like her husband, she had low regard for human life. After the war ended, Lisa was held in a British internment camp, but was released without being charged. That didn't mean her troubles were over, though. In 1947, the People's Special Court in Prague sentenced her to life imprisonment with 20 years of hard labor for her treatment of prisoners on her Czech estate. Witnesses testified that she was cruel and arrogant, often allowing SS guards to beat workers if she deemed them to be slacking. Despite the severity of the charges, Lina managed to avoid extradition to Czechoslovakia. Instead, she faced a denazification trial in Germany in 1949. Surprisingly, she was classified as a Category 4 offender, which meant she was seen as a mere follower rather than a major perpetrator. This classification allowed her to avoid a custodial sentence and retain her property. Lina herself expressed surprise at the court's leniency, noting that she was one of the few Nazi women who did not serve prison time. Lina moved back to Fehmarn, where she converted her family villa into a guest house. This establishment became a meeting place for former SS members and their families. She also became involved with Silent Help, an organization dedicated to supporting imprisoned SS men and reintegrating them into society after their release. Throughout her post-war life, Lina continued to defend Reinhard Heydrich's legacy. She frequently gave interviews and cooperated with historians, selectively choosing those she deemed objective. Lina's frustration with how her husband was portrayed in various books led her to write her own account. In her book, My Life with a War Criminal, published in 1976, Lina presented an unapologetic view of their ideological beliefs and downplayed Heydrich's involvement in the final solution. She attempted to paint him as a multifaceted individual, highlighting his talents as a musician, his athleticism, and his patriotism. Lina claimed that the extermination program began after Heydrich's death and insisted that he was unaware of the horrors that were to come. However, she also expressed doubts and hinted that Heydrich might have been involved in the early planning stages. Despite her efforts, the book did not have a significant impact and has never been translated into English. In her later years, Lina continued to live in Fehmarn, maintaining a close relationship with her children. Her son Haider studied engineering and later worked for the Dornier Aircraft Company, while her daughter Marta married a local farmer and opened a small fashion shop. As hard it is to believe, Lina ultimately won a legal battle with the German state to receive the full pension owed to her as the widow of a German police general killed in action. Lina Heydrich died on August 14, 1985, at the age of 74. Not long before her death, she gave a television interview in which she expressed pride in being Lina Heydrich. Throughout her life, she remained devoted to her husband's memory and sought to reshape his legacy in the eyes of the world. Ilse Hess, the unyielding matriarch of the Third Reich. Another woman who remained loyal to her husband's Nazi legacy was Ilse Hess. Born Ilse Prohl to a respected doctor in Berlin, she grew up in a privileged environment. As a bright and energetic girl, Ilse was keen on music and literature. She enjoyed hiking and camping, reflecting the middle-class values of escaping urban life. In the spring of 1920, Ilse met Rudolph Hess, a tall young man in a tattered uniform. Hess was a war veteran who had been wounded twice and had joined the von Epp Freikorps regiment. Despite his curt manner, Ilse was attracted to his combination of thinker and man of action. Hess introduced Ilse to Adolf Hitler, who impressed them both. Ilse quickly became involved in the Nazi movement, delivering leaflets, putting up posters, and helping with the party newspaper. She also acted as Hess's secretary. Ilse's commitment to the Nazi cause was evident in a letter to a school friend, where she declared her staunch anti-Semitism and support for the movement's ideals. Ilse and Hess got married in December 1927. They moved into a small apartment in Munich, but their relationship remained largely platonic. Ilse followed the new Nazi rules about female participation in the movement, which restricted her to party membership without any official roles. Despite this, her proximity to Hitler gave her influence. When Rudolf Hess was captured after his flight to Scotland in 1941, Ilse's life changed dramatically. Despite having no hope of his return, Ilse remained devoted to Rudolf and dedicated herself to his cause. She communicated with him through letters, despite the long delays that made life difficult for both of them. Hess also suffered from amnesia, which disturbed Ilse, but she refused to admit defeat and consulted doctors who reassured her that his memory would return after the war. In 1945, the war ended and Hess returned to Germany, but not in the way Ilse hoped for. Rudolf Hess, the notorious war criminal, was transferred to Nuremberg to be trialed with the rest of the Nazi gang. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison and moved to Spandau prison. Ilse too was arrested in June 1947 and transferred to an imprisonment camp. However, less than a year later, she was released from prison. Ilse used every moment of her freedom tirelessly to secure Rudolf's release. Despite the difficulties, she maintained contact with Hess through letters and visits. Her dedication to Hess and the Nazi ideology never wavered. Ilse moved to Munich and reconnected with former friends, of which one was Winifred Wagner, granddaughter of composer Richard Wagner and close friend of Adolf Hitler. Ilse opened a guest house in the Bavarian Alps, hoping that one day Rudolf would walk out of Spandau and join her. She kept a room set aside for him with his books, manuscripts, papers, a radio, and some toys he and their son Wolf used to play with together. Ilse also published collections of her correspondence with Rudolf in a book called Rudolf Hess, Prisoner of Peace, trying to gain publicity for her cause. Ilse tirelessly campaigned for her husband's release. She formed the Freedom for Rudolf Hess Support Association and gathered over 40,000 signatures from people in 40 different countries. She also sent letters to politicians, intellectuals, bishops, journalists, and historians, asking for their support. Despite her efforts, the Soviets remained adamant about keeping Rudolf imprisoned, considering him as culpable as the other defendants at Nuremberg and angry that he had been spared death. In the meantime, Rudolf's health continued to deteriorate. He attempted suicide multiple times and suffered from various ailments, including a stroke that left him almost blind. Unlike him, Ilse never gave up hope. She continued to visit Rudolf in Spandau, bringing him gifts and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy during their brief meetings. Apart from Rudolf, Ilse maintained her loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi ideology. In her letters, she expressed her happiness that he remained loyal to Hitler and that nothing had changed in her inward relationship to the man with whose destiny we have been so closely linked in joy and suffering for more than 20 years. Because of such her stance, Ilse faced social ostracism and financial difficulties. Ilse's financial situation worsened. With limited means of support, she relied on the help of friends and sympathizers from the old Nazi network. The stigma of being associated with a high-ranking Nazi official followed her wherever she went, but she remained steadfast in her beliefs. She lived in modest accommodations, often moving to avoid harassment. Ilse visited Hess whenever possible, maintaining a steady stream of letters to him. Her visits were a lifeline for Rudolf, who spent decades in solitary confinement. Her health deteriorated, but her determination to support her husband never waned. In the 1970s, Ilse's health further declined. She suffered from various ailments but continued to campaign for her husband's release. The burden of her efforts was heavy, but she pressed on, driven by a deep sense of duty and loyalty. Ilse's tireless advocacy took a toll on her health, and she eventually took a back seat, allowing her son Wolf to continue the campaign. Rudolf Hess's death in 1987 was a devastating blow to Ilse. She was denied the opportunity to be with him in his final moments, which added to her grief. This, however, didn't stop her from being a fervent Nazi until the end of her life in 1995. Unlike Ilse, her son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, never really had the chance to meet his father. He was only 3 years old when Rudolf flew to Scotland on a solo mission, an event that led to his imprisonment and lifelong separation from his family. Therefore, Wolf Rudiger's childhood was marked by the absence of his father. He grew up with letters from Rudolf. These letters were his main connection to his father, who refused to receive visitors under what he considered undignified circumstances. As a result, Wolf Rudiger never truly knew his father and only had photos and letters to form an image of him. During his youth, Wolf Rudiger had to navigate the complex emotions and societal reactions to his father's legacy. When he traveled with his mother to Nuremberg in 1946 to see his father during the trials, he was just a boy, clutching a letter from his father. He did not understand the full weight of his father's actions, but felt the impact of societal judgment. Despite this burden that truly bothered him, Wolf Rudiger strived to lead a normal life. He studied architecture and 1961 qualified as an architect, but the obstacles were many. In 1959, Wolf Rudiger faced probably the most significant challenge when he was called up for military service. During his medical examination at the district recruitment office in Munich, he declared his refusal to serve. This declaration required him to provide detailed reasons for his objection to the Conscientious Objectors Review Board. Hess explained that his father was Rudolph Hess, imprisoned in Spandau, and that he could not serve a military judged by the same alliance that had condemned his father. Wolf Rudiger's refusal to serve in the military was a significant stance, reflecting his deep moral convictions and the complexities of his father's legacy. He was a young man trying to navigate a world that judged him for his father's actions, while also trying to uphold his principles. Living in Munich, Wolf Rudiger continued to face challenges related to his father's legacy. He worked towards building his own life, separate from the infamous actions of Rudolf Hess. Yet the constant reminder of his father's role in Nazi Germany was a burden he had to carry until the end of his life. In 1987, Rudolf suffered one final strike. His father was found dead in the prison garden house, hanged by an extension cord over a window latch. He was buried in a secret location, but the family managed to persuade the authorities to move his body to the family plot. Wolf Rudiger simply couldn't cope with his father's destiny. He couldn't believe he committed suicide and accused the British Secret Intelligence Service of his death. For the remaining of his life, Wolf Rudiger committed to defending the legacy of his father, about whom he wrote 3 books: My Father Rudolf Hess, Who Murdered My Father, Rudolf Hess, and Rudolf Hess, I Regret Nothing. Wolf Rudiger Hess suffered a stroke in 2001 and not long after died in a hospital in Munich. Descendants of Martin Bormann, A Legacy in the Shadows. Truth be told, not all relatives of the Nazi official could come to terms with their deeds. One of them was Martin Bormann Jr., the son of Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's closest aides. Born in 1930, Martin Jr. was only a teenager when the war ended, which left his family facing a number of challenges. In the final days of the war, along with his mother Gerda and 8 other siblings, Martin fled to the South Tyrol region, trying to escape the advancing Allied forces. They were met by the local Nazi boss, who helped them hide in a small village near Bolzano. At the time, Mother Gerda was suffering from advanced ovarian cancer, which caused her immense pain. A local doctor diagnosed her condition and recommended immediate surgery. However, the operation was not successful, and Gerda's health continued to decline. During this time, 2 British intelligence agents tracked the family down, but an army major who thought Gerda was a nice woman assured her that she and her children were not in danger of being sent to a concentration camp. Instead, Gerda was taken to a hospital for POWs in Merano, where she received further medical care. Gerda died on March 23, 1946, just shy of her 37th birthday. Now orphans, Gerda's children were placed in the care of Reverend Theodor Schmitz, a German Army Catholic chaplain. They were left alone to deal with the difficult heritage their father left behind. Martin Jr. especially struggled to come to terms with his father's actions during the war. He loved his dad, but was also confronted with the reality of his role in the Nazi regime. This conflict shaped much of Martin Jr.'s adult life. In the early 1950s, Martin Jr. converted to Catholicism and made faith became a cornerstone of his identity. He found peace and purpose in his new beliefs. He dedicated himself to working as a lay missionary, visiting schools, and speaking about the dangers of fascism and the importance of reconciliation. His faith offered him a way to deal with his father's legacy and find a new path in life. In 1958, he was ordained priest, and in 1961 he moved to Congo, where he worked as a missionary for 3 years. Despite his efforts to distance himself from his father's past, Martin Jr. could not entirely escape it. He interacted with other children of Nazi leaders, sharing their experiences of stigma and societal judgment. These interactions highlighted the shared challenges they faced. Martin Jr. often had to explain his father's actions were his own and justify he was a person with different beliefs and choices. Probably for that reason, Martin Jr. became a theology teacher, choosing a profession that allowed him to make a positive impact on others. He worked hard to build a life that was separate from his father's actions. His dedication to education and his faith helped him navigate the challenges he faced. He wanted to be known for his own merits, not just as the son of a notorious Nazi leader. Martin Jr. married a fellow Catholic, and they had several children. He was determined to provide his children with an environment free from the shadows of the past. However, the weight of his father's legacy was always present. It influenced his parenting and personal relationships. A significant moment in Martin Jr.'s life was his visit to his father's grave, which was kept secret to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. Martin Jr. described the visit as a moment of profound reflection. He felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. In his later years, Martin Jr. continued to reflect on his father's legacy. He remained active in his community, using his experiences to educate others about the horrors of the Third Reich. However, it turned out that Martin Jr. had demons of his own. In 2011, he was accused of raping a boy back in the 1960s. Other pupils also accused him of severe physical violence. By that time, Martin Bormann Jr. was a senile old man and no legal proceedings were conducted, although the accuser was awarded compensation. Martin Jr. died 2 years later at the age of 83. Rudolph von Ribbentrop, the legacy of a diplomat's son. Rudolph von Ribbentrop was a person who suffered from being related to a high Nazi official even during the Nazi era. His father was the famous Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nazi Germany from 1938 to 1945. As a young man, Rudolph joined the SS and began his training at the SS Junker School in Braunschweig, an academy for training the SS officers. Right from the start, he faced discrimination because of his father. Despite being the best in his class, Rudolph was not promoted early because of his father's position. He was expected to behave modestly and not seek any special treatment. When in 1940 Nazis launched a Western campaign, Rudolph was eager to fight and managed to join the campaign by convincing his father to allow it. He participated in battles where he experienced heavy enemy fire and saw his comrades die. Rudolph continued to face discrimination even after proving himself in battle. When he was ready to graduate from the military academy, he wanted to join the elite SS Panzer Division, Viking. However, due to an order from Himmler, he was sent to a less active combat group in Norway as a disciplinary measure. In 1941, Rudolph was severely wounded in Karelia, but returned to fight again. He joined a newly formed tank column under Sepp Dietrich's command. He fought bravely in many battles, including the Normandy campaign in 1944, where he was again wounded. Despite his injuries, Rudolph refused to leave his men and continued to lead them. Rudolph von Ribbentrop was captured by the Americans south of the Danube. He was taken prisoner to avoid falling into Russian hands, which could have been fatal due to his name. In the American camp, he faced harsh treatment. A young American guard robbed him, taking his cigarette case and decorations. However, when Rudolph accused the guard of theft, an older sergeant showed disgust at the guard's behavior and returned some of his belongings. Over time, Rudolph was transferred to different camps, where he experienced different conditions and treatments, all because of his name. In Dachau, he discovered he was listed as a war criminal for pillaging in Harcourt. He was offered help to escape by the German camp chief, but Rudolph decided to stay and face the charges. He believed running away would not help clear his name. Based on accusations, Rudolph was handed over to the French in January 1947. At Cherchemidi prison, his poor treatment continued. He was strip-searched in front of female staff, and his belongings were again taken. He spent a freezing night in a cell with broken windows, after which he was transferred to a small cell with 2 other men, sharing cramped and uncomfortable conditions. One evening, French officers and their wives visited the cells, treating the prisoners like exhibits. Rudolph found this humiliating. Rudolph's situation improved slightly when he met Dr. Epting, who advised him to get a lawyer. Rudolph's mother contacted old family friends for help. Sir Alexander Walker of the Johnnie Walker Whiskey Company provided the money needed. The lawyer reassured him that the charges were weak, but still, Rudolph had to endure a lasting and exhausting legal procedure. Despite the harsh conditions and slow legal process, Rudolph maintained his dignity. He faced each challenge with resilience, whether it was dealing with cruel guards or fighting charges. This period tested his strength and patience, but he remained determined to clear his name. In July 1948, Rudolph was granted provisional release. He was sent to the Schultz family in Gau-Bischofsheim. He felt a mix of relief and disbelief. For the first time in over 3 years, he regained his freedom. Adjusting to post-war life was challenging. Rudolph had to rebuild his life from scratch, and his family name made finding work difficult. Many people were suspicious of him because of his father's past. Despite this, Rudolph remained determined to start anew, finding ways to support himself and his family. He decided to enter the family business, founded by his mother's father. His mum, who was a partner in the company, nominated Rudolph as a managing partner, but the family of her sister opposed the proposal due to Rudolph's family background. They believed that having a partner bearing the name of Ribbentrop would affect the business. In the end, Rudolph settled with the family for compensation and moved to his friend's company, where he developed a successful career as a banker. Rudolph von Ribbentrop died in 2019 at the age of 98 as a man who managed to build a whole new life out of the ashes of his father's legacy. The Schirach brothers, lives entwined with the Third Reich. Living with the legacy of criminal parents was indeed a nightmare in post-war Germany. Aside from social ostracism, these individuals had to confront the fact that their loved ones committed some of the most gruesome atrocities humanity had ever seen. Each of them had to find their own way how to cope with this. No different were the von Schirach brothers, sons of Baldur von Schirach, a prominent Nazi leader and head of the Hitler Youth. Their post-war lives were shaped by the need to come to terms with his actions and their own identities. Baldur von Schirach was a key figure in the Nazi regime, responsible for indoctrinating German youth. After the war, he was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison for crimes against humanity. His career and his trial left a significant mark on his family, especially his sons, who had to live with the stigma of their father's actions. This chapter describes how each brother dealt with this legacy differently. One of the brothers, Klaus von Schirach, became a lawyer. He was determined to show the world he was capable of leading a life separate from his father's shadow. Klaus's career in law was a way for him to establish his own identity and gain respect in a post-war society that was quick to judge the children of Nazi leaders. Klaus worked hard to be seen as an individual, not merely as the son of a notorious figure. He believed that his professional achievements could help him build a new reputation. Despite the challenges, Klaus remained committed to his career, using it as a way to prove his worth and integrity. He wanted people to see him for his own merits, separate from the actions of his father. However, in this environment, he was often brought into situations where he had to address or at least acknowledge his father's role in the Nazi regime. This was a constant reminder of the past he was trying to move beyond. Robert von Schirach, in contrast, chose a quieter and more private life. Unlike Klaus, who engaged with the world through his profession, Robert preferred to avoid the limelight. He did not seek public validation and instead focused on his personal life and family. This decision was his way of coping with the heavy burden of his father's past. By leading a private life, Robert was able to distance himself from the controversies surrounding his father's legacy. Robert's choice to stay out of the public eye allowed him to shield himself and his family from the direct impact of their father's notoriety. He believed that by avoiding public scrutiny, he could create a safer and more peaceful environment for his loved ones. However, this did not mean that he was unaffected by his father's actions. The shadow of Baldur von Schirach loomed large over both brothers, influencing their decisions and paths in life. Despite their different approaches, Both Klaus and Robert shared the common goal of finding a way to live their lives while carrying the weight of their family history. Niklas and Norman Frank, sons of the Reich. Similar was the fate of Niklas and Norman Frank, sons of Hans Frank, Hitler's governor-general in Poland. Hans Frank was known for his reign of terror in occupied Poland and direct involvement in mass murders of Jews. He was personally responsible for the death of more than 4 million people. One can only imagine how heavy was the weight carried by his two sons after the war. Nicholas Frank was particularly deeply affected by his father's actions. Throughout his life, he struggled with immense guilt and shame associated with his family name. Niklas was very vocal about his contempt for his father's deeds and was determined to confront the reality of what his father had done. He decided early on in his life not to shy away from the truth, but to face it head-on. Niklas finished German literature, sociology and history studies, and eventually became a journalist. Throughout his career, he often spoke about the curse of being a Frank. He believed that his father's legacy had led to the tragic deaths of his 3 siblings. This belief weighed heavily on him. Over the years, as he uncovered the details of his father's monstrosities, Niklas's feeling of embarrassment about his father evolved into an obsessive hatred. He indeed hated his father intensely. Niklas frequently questioned how he could live with such a name, knowing the atrocities his father had committed. His internal conflict was evident in his interactions and writings, as he feared that he might inherit any of his father's traits. This struggle shaped much of his adult life and made him a unique figure among the children of Nazi leaders. His older brother Norman, on the other hand, chose a different path. Like Robert von Schirach, he decided to live a quieter life. Norman distanced himself from the public eye and the controversy surrounding his father's past. Unlike Niklas, Norman did not seek the spotlight. He sought to live a life free from the infamy associated with his father's name. A quiet life reflected his desire to move beyond the past. He never publicly condemned his father, but he also did not defend him. What's more, he avoided discussing his father's actions. This was his way of coping with the shame and guilt. The stories of Niklas and Norman Frank show how each brother found his own way to cope with the legacy of their father, Hans Frank. Their lives highlight the complex emotions and challenges faced by the children, wives, brothers and sisters of those who played significant roles in the atrocities of the Nazi regime.